Well, we're joined now by Adedayo Olowoniyi, who's the Chief Technical Advisor to the Minister for Power. And in our studios in Lagos is Martins Arogie, who is a partner at the Energy and Natural Resources Group and head power subsector group at KPMG Nigeria. Let's start off with Olowoniyi. You know, a lot of things happening. First of all, let's talk about the silver lining before my questions. It then means with the cries of Nigerians, it looks like power has improved because we thought that there wasn't power supply at all in Nigeria. Now, speak to us about the specific actions that are being taken to address the situation now that the minister has said, well, there is guaranteed power supply within the year, within the week.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think it's a really unfortunate situation in where we are, in that the fact that the North, does not have electricity at this point. But it was almost like a double whammy of issues where the Shiroro-Mando line was vandalized and was down. And at the same time, the alternative route from Ugaji through Makurdi was also then vandalized. So at the same time, typically when that line is vandalized, we would have been able to use an alternative route. But at the moment, both are down. So one of the things that we focused on is to focus on the Ugaji line, because at the moment it's easier to fix. And all hands are on deck to ensure that that line is up and running within the next 2 to 3 days. So we're absolutely convinced that we should be able to start supplying a part of the North, at least 80% of the electricity going to the North within the next 2 to 3 days. And then the follow-up on that is that the Shiroro-Mando line, all efforts are also on deck. The President has asked the security agencies to support us in the power sector to ensure that the contractor can go on site and actually fix that line, because that's the main line that actually supplies the North. And that should be completed within 10 to 14 days as we continue to put in the effort to ensure that that is done. So I think those are the two immediate actions that have been in place to ensure that power is restored to the North as quickly as possible.
Right. Well, from all indication, it looks like it's just a temporary solution to a problem that seems to be perennial. Let me bring in Martins Arogie. Well, it's been said that fixing Nigeria's power problem is really not rocket science, but it does seem that it is rocket science. What do you think is fundamentally wrong with our power sector that needs to be dealt with, from the root?
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm not particularly sure I would say it is not rocket science, because maybe rocket science is a bit complex, but actually the issues are a whole lot more complex than people make it sound like. And that's why you hear things like, oh, just break down the grid, do regional grids, do smaller grids. But it's interesting that since the government signed into law the Electricity Amendment Act, you would hardly find any private investor that has taken it upon himself to begin to construct a grid across any region or across any state. So it tells you that there is a fundamental problem around the economics and the commercialization of power in Nigeria. And that harkens back to our mindset. We spent a lot of time where power was essentially treated as a social good in Nigeria, where we were not used to paying any real value for the power that was supplied. And that has impacted significantly the ability to fully commercialize the sector. And then when you then introduce private sector players and into a sector where the commercials or the economic foundations are not particularly very stable, then it would also impact the ability to also drive the right level of investments. I think I heard the minister speaking and talking about how the grid is about 55 years old. And I saw people on Twitter say, oh, the US grid is over 120-something years old. So 50-something years old is relatively young. But it's not just about age. It's also about what level of investment has gone into that grid in terms of trying to upscale and maintain the infrastructure over the 55 years, or over the 126 years. So a grid may be 100, 200 years old, but if it has not experienced the level of investment that is required to continue to ensure that it keeps up to date with power demands and power supply, then it would struggle. And I think that that's where we have a problem. It's a serious infrastructure deficit that we have. And trying to then get in place the right economic model that would encourage and incentivize private sector to be able to commit resources into that necessary infrastructure development. Otherwise, we'll just continue to just beat around the bush and just begin to struggle. There is so much call on government every time we have these issues. But interestingly, other than transmission, every other sector has been privatized. So what government is supposed to do is basically to put in place a conducive environment for the private sector to thrive. And that's a bit difficult when we consider also the mindset and where we are coming from, where, again, like I said, power has essentially been treated as a social good. So there's a lot of foundation that we need to address.
Well, I'm happy that you've actually taken it to that aspect, and Adedayo is here with us. Perhaps you should be able to let us in on some of the key things the government is likely to do. Adedayo, a lot of businesses, the market has been opened, but for TCN, we've seen, even if you recall in Lagos, Sura Market is not on the grid of Ecodisco or Ikeja Electric. They're plugged into the independent power of Lagos Island. So we also recall that that's also one of the key things the former minister had spoken about, talking about Bat Naji. So is this something that the government is also looking at in ensuring that these are broken down to the extent that private participation will ensure that we take on some of these huge tasks of the discos and even TCN?
Right. So maybe I'll continue from where the other individual that was speaking earlier.
That's Martins.
Yeah, Mr. Martins, thank you very much. I think commercialization is a key issue. And I think Mr. Martins put it spot on. If you're really going to get private sector investment in this segment, then there has to be a requisite amount of return that they're going to be able to get. Based on our behavioral patterns, where electricity was a social good, it's going to take some time for us to get to a point where everybody really realizes that, you know, electricity has a cost and we have to pay for it, but at the same time we have to get the service. So that's part of the challenge of the private sector. As Mr. Martin said, the value chain has been significantly privatized, and it's only really the transmission that is not yet privatized. And in fact, the transmission requires significant level of investment. As you said, you know, there's a lot of dilapidated infrastructure, there's a lot of old infrastructure, there's a lot of new investment that has to come in. For example, the Honorable Minister has mentioned investment in SCADA, automation, to ensure that the grid is actually controlled automatically, rather than today where we still control the grid by using telephone calls to ramp down or ramp up generation plants. These things are supposed to be automated. You know, substations are automated today. They should be able to work remotely, and we are not yet there. So again, to bring in private sector investment and make it work, and to create the conducive environment, I think we have to continue going down the road of commercializing the sector so that it becomes more conducive for the private sector investors, and they can bring additional investments into the sector.
Right. Martins, let me bring it back to you, and let's narrow it down back to the issue of transmission lines. Every now and again, they're vandalized, and people are asking, is it a case of sabotage? What exactly is the motive? Are terrorists, you know, gaining access to these transmission lines? So on the one hand, how do we protect these transmission lines? And on the other hand, again, there are calls for adoption of other energy sources like solar, you know, wind, biofuels, non-renewable resources or sources that Nigeria has in, you know, abundance.
Yeah, so again, which is why I said earlier that at times a lot of people say these things and it appears very simple. But I'll give an example with Sura that you mentioned. The reason why someone was willing to make that investment in Sura was because the person, first of all, identified that there is capacity to pay within that particular franchise area. So these are guys who are high users of power. They have the capacity to pay. The cost of the alternative will be higher for them than if they had regular supply. So it made business sense. So you can say, yeah, go up north. It's pretty hot there. There's significant potential to build solar plants there. But who will pay for those plants? What's the capacity to pay for power? Why would a private investor set up a power plant up north? Remember, close to 90% of those on the grid today are still under some form of government subsidy. So if I was a private sector player looking to tap into alternative sources of generating power in certain locations in Nigeria, the question I'll be asking myself is, will government be willing to pay a subsidy for an independent mini grid and for the customers on that independent mini grid? I doubt it. So that would also impact that decision. So it's not just about alternative sources of power, it's about also coming back to the same issue around commercialization. On the security one, I think it's very similar to what we used to see in the Niger Delta and the IOCs, where for a considerable amount of time, security was a very significant issue. And then the IOCs began to get very involved in organizing security for their pipelines, for their operations, and the cost also became very, very, very punitive at some point. I don't want us to get to that point in the power sector. I don't think it's the responsibility of any business, whether it is in oil and gas or in power, to concern themselves around security of installations and security of facilities. That's the responsibility of the security agencies. So I don't want to dwell too much on that because it's not a power issue. It's a general security issue, whether it is sabotage, whether it is economic theft, people trying to sell those equipments when they pilfer them. But that should not be something for the power companies to bother about. They should be able to make that investment and then run that investment in an environment that is conducive and that is secured under the umbrella provided by the relevant security agencies in the country.
It's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen. Adedayo Olowoniyi, Chief Technical Advisor to the Minister of Power, and Martin Arogie in Lagos studio there, Partner Energy and Natural Resources Group, Head Power Subsector at KPMG. Thanks for joining us.